sip your tea, and let your mind drift back to the year 1900. The world smelled like coal, most people hadn't brushed their teeth in a while, and if you were poor, well, life was mostly about surviving one week to the next. Now, when people romanticize the good old days, they usually imagine candlelight dinners, horse-drawn carriages, and women in elegant dresses holding parasols. That's cute. But for the average person, the one not painted in an oil portrait, the good old days were mostly about damp socks, hungry children, and landlords who could evict you faster than you could say, industrial revolution. Let's settle in and take a little stroll, well, a tired, hungry shuffle, through the world of the poor in 1900. It's the dawn of a new century, and the world is buzzing with optimism, just not for you. If you were part of the working class in 1900, chances are you lived in a small rented room in a city that smelled perpetually of smoke and sewage. Your rent ate half your wages, and your job, if you were lucky enough to have one, was probably dangerous, monotonous, and soul-numbingly repetitive. In London, tenements packed entire families into single rooms. The walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's every cough, argument, and nightly despair. A two-room flat was considered a luxury. That's one room for sleeping and one for everything else. Cooking, eating, giving birth, dying. Often in that order. If you were poor in New York, things weren't much better. The Lower East Side had buildings so crowded that air barely reached the middle rooms. One journalist wrote that the air in those tenements was thick enough to slice. Which sounds dramatic, but if you've ever stood too close to an unventilated stove, you get the picture. Children worked because there wasn't really a choice. In 1900, 1 in 5 American children under the age of 15 had a job. They sold newspapers, crawled into coal chutes, or worked looms in textile mills. The factories were loud and full of lint that coated your lungs like fuzzy glue. If a machine took your finger, or your whole hand, your boss probably docked your pay for damaging company property. Of course, people said it built character, but it mostly built respiratory issues. Let's drift over to rural Europe for a moment. The cities get all the attention, but the countryside had its own brand of misery. In Ireland, the shadow of the Great Famine still hung heavy. Farmers eked out a living on tiny plots of land, hoping the weather didn't turn or the potatoes didn't rot again. In Russia, peasants lived in small wooden huts called izbas, often sharing them with livestock for warmth. Which sounds cute until you realize that warmth came with fleas, manure, and the occasional goat nibbling your bedding. Their meals were mostly bread, cabbage, and if you were lucky, a bit of soup with something floating in it that might have been meat at some point. Tea was the comfort of the poor. Cheap, hot, and available in every corner of the empire. In Britain, even the most destitute households would try to keep a tin of tea leaves. Because if you couldn't afford proper meals, at least you could sip something that felt civilized. Bathing was optional, mostly because it was a logistical nightmare. In many homes, there wasn't running water. So, you boiled a kettle, filled a basin, and hoped you got to wash before the water went cold, or before the baby knocked it over. Soap was a luxury. Towels, thinner than paper. And the idea of daily hygiene? That was for the rich. The poor might have washed once a week if things were going well. Otherwise, you just hoped everyone else smelled equally bad so it canceled out. Still, there was pride. People kept their clothes as clean as possible, patching and mending them again and again until the original fabric was mostly memory. A working man's shirt might have been repaired a dozen times before it was retired, and women darned socks in the evening by candlelight because a new pair cost more than dinner. Now, let's talk about food, because nothing says, "we're surviving," like 1900s cuisine. If you lived in Britain or America, you might eat bread, dripping, which is just fat that's cooled into a jelly-like spread, and maybe some porridge. Meat was a treat, unless you were near a dockyard where the butcher could sell you scraps for cheap. Milk was unpasteurized, so it was often spoiled before it even reached your door. But you drank it anyway because calcium wasn't optional. And yes, people still believed that beer and gin were safer than water, because often they were. City water was contaminated with industrial waste and sewage. So, it wasn't uncommon for a worker to start his morning with a pint of mild ale instead of coffee. Not because he was an alcoholic, but because it was literally safer. Of course, Drinking to forget your problems was also an option. The gin epidemic of the late 1800s had faded, but alcohol remained the cheapest escape. If you were exhausted, broke, and living in a one-room flat with 6 other humans, a cheap drink could at least make you forget you hadn't eaten properly in days. Let's drift to another part of the world. Say, India under British rule. Here, poor was a different universe altogether. Many peasants lived on the brink of starvation, their lives tied to land they didn't own. Famines struck regularly. The British government, with its charming blend of bureaucracy and apathy, often responded by setting up relief works, essentially forcing starving people to build roads in exchange for a handful of rice. It was charity, technically, just the exhausting, backbreaking kind. In China, 1900 marked the end of the Qing dynasty's long, slow crumble. Poverty was everywhere. Rural peasants worked endless hours in the fields for a fraction of what their crops were worth, and when natural disasters struck, there was little safety net. Families sold what they could. Sometimes that meant furniture. Sometimes, tragically, it meant children. And yet, amid all of this, people kept going. Because what else could they do? The poor had communities, tight, sometimes suffocating, but deeply connected. Neighbors shared scraps, mothers nursed each other's babies, and gossip served as the main entertainment. A neighborhood might have been grim, but it was alive. You'd hear street vendors calling out, children playing in alleys, and someone singing off-key after too much ale. It wasn't cheerful exactly, but it was human. Religion offered comfort. Church on Sunday meant clean clothes, a few hymns, and maybe a free bowl of soup if your church was generous. For many, faith was the one place where they could imagine a world that made sense. Because in this one it didn't. As the industrial age rolled on, people began to talk, softly at first, about things like workers' rights. Unions were forming. Socialists were meeting in smoky rooms above pubs. They were tired of 12-hour workdays and wages that could barely buy bread. Some governments started to notice, mostly because they were afraid of revolution. Germany, for instance, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, introduced accident insurance and old-age pensions, revolutionary at the time. It wasn't generosity. It was self-preservation. Give the workers just enough to keep them from burning the place down. In America, progress came slower. But journalists known as muckrakers began exposing the filth and cruelty of city life. Their work helped bring reforms, child labor laws, building codes, sanitation efforts. Still, it was a slow crawl forward. The average poor person in 1900 wouldn't have noticed much change in their daily life. Maybe cleaner water, maybe fewer rats. But the grind stayed the same. Let's float for a moment into a different kind of poverty, emotional poverty. Because even among the rich, loneliness was everywhere. You could be wealthy and miserable, poor and content, or somewhere in between. The lower classes might have been exhausted, but they had companionship. The wealthy had privacy and isolation. The poor sang in the streets. The rich hid behind curtains. And in a strange way, that made the poor the most alive of all. So, as you lie back and imagine yourself in 1900, maybe you're a seamstress mending clothes by lamplight, or a miner coughing coal dust into your pillow. Remember that this was the real world for most people. Not carriages and silk gloves, but cracked hands and borrowed blankets. Life was shorter, harsher, but somehow people still found joy. In a song, a shared loaf of bread, or a warm kettle on a cold night. The world kept turning, and so did they. Chapter 2. The Tenement Life, Urban Survival in 1900. If you lived in a city in 1900, chances are you didn't live so much as you existed inside a box. They called them tenements. We might call them fire hazards. But to millions of families, those creaky, overcrowded buildings were home. The kind of home where you knew everyone's business whether you wanted to or not. Imagine an entire building packed with people, each floor subdivided into little rectangles of rented air. A single room might hold a family of 6, a few chickens, and an optimistic pot plant trying its best near the one small window. If you were lucky enough to have that window, you guarded it like treasure because it meant light, or at least something resembling light when the smog wasn't too thick. The hallways were narrow, the walls damp, and the smell layered. A mix of boiled cabbage, sweat, coal smoke, and that sweet tang of poverty that clung to everything. But you got used to it. Eventually, your nose gave up. Tenements were a side effect of progress, the kind of progress that looks great in history books but felt awful in person. Cities were booming. Factories were multiplying. People flooded in from the countryside, chasing dreams that usually turned out to be 12-hour shifts and a shared mattress. The landlords, clever creatures that they were, realized you could earn more by dividing one big building into as many small spaces as physically possible. So they did. Walls were thrown up hastily. Plumbing was an optional feature. And ventilation? Only if the wind was feeling generous. In New York City, some tenements had a single outdoor toilet for 20 or 30 people. The privy was usually in the courtyard, and if you think that sounds unpleasant in winter, imagine it in July. Diseases spread easily: cholera, typhus, tuberculosis. You could practically catch something just by breathing near the drain. When reformers began investigating, they were horrified. One called it a museum of misery. Another described children sleeping in shifts because there wasn't enough floor space for everyone to lie down at once. And yet, somehow life went on. Because it had to. Daily life followed a rhythm. Before dawn, the streets came alive with the sounds of carts, horses, and shouting vendors. Men went to factories, women took in laundry or sewing work, and children ran errands or worked right alongside their parents. At night, the building hummed with noise. Babies crying, couples arguing, someone playing a sad tune on a harmonica 2 floors up. And always, the coughs. That dry, hollow sound that never really stopped. A kind of background music of urban poverty. If you lived on the top floor, you were lucky. You got more light and maybe a breeze. But in winter, the heat never reached you. Downstairs, in the damp basement flats, it was worse. Always cold, always wet, always dark. Rats treated the place like a family estate, generations of them living quite comfortably alongside the tenants. Laundry was a full-time battle. With no running water in most buildings, women carried heavy buckets up and down endless stairs. They washed clothes by hand in metal tubs, rubbing them against boards until their knuckles cracked. Then they hung the clothes out the window on ropes, praying they didn't fall into the street below, where the smell of horse manure was a permanent feature. Clean clothes were a luxury, not because people didn't care, but because cleanliness required time, soap, and energy most didn't have. Still, women did their best. Because even in the worst slums, people wanted to look respectable. It was a kind of quiet defiance. We might be poor, but we're not animals. Food was another story. Most tenement kitchens didn't have proper stoves, so meals were simple. Bread, potatoes, maybe some stew that could stretch over a few days. Street food was popular, a baked potato from a vendor, or a slice of pie if you had a spare penny. Milk was often watered down. Butter was rare. Meat was a once-a-week luxury. And refrigeration? Not a thing. People kept perishables on windowsills in winter, and in the summer, they just hoped for the best. Spoiled food was common, but so were strong stomachs. For the children, candy and pickles were the ultimate treats, cheap and intensely flavored, which probably explains why some Victorian candy had ingredients that would now require a hazard warning. Lead, arsenic, and formaldehyde all made their appearances in sweets at one point or another. But hey, at least they were colorful. If you had children, you worried constantly. Not about grades or college, about survival. Accidents were common. Fires, illness, and workplace injuries could strike any day. Many kids started working as soon as they could walk and talk. A 10-year-old could be found in a factory, a coal mine, or delivering goods through city streets, often barefoot, even in winter. Reformers would come through with notebooks, shaking their heads, writing down the horror of it all. Then they'd leave, and the children would keep working. Because when your family needed rent money, moral outrage didn't pay the bills. Social life happened mostly in the streets. The tenement buildings were too cramped for gatherings, so people congregated outside, leaning against walls, sitting on stoops, gossiping loudly. Street musicians played violins or accordions. Peddlers sold whatever they could: old clothes, tin cups, bits of string. In summer, kids splashed in the gutters because it was the only water around. Sundays were sacred, not necessarily for religion, but for rest. Factories slowed, markets opened, and for a few hours, the neighborhood felt like a community instead of a struggle. People wore their best clothes, often the only decent set they owned, and strolled through parks that reformers had built to elevate the morals of the working class. Mostly, they just enjoyed being outdoors where the air, while still bad, didn't smell directly of sewage. The health risks were endless. Tuberculosis was called the White Plague. It killed 1 in every 7 people in the world by 1900. The cramped conditions of tenements were the perfect breeding ground. Once one person caught it, the entire floor would soon be coughing too. Doctors were expensive, so people turned to home remedies. Some swore by onion syrup. Others used turpentine. And of course, there was alcohol, because if you can't cure it, you can at least forget it for a bit. Pharmacies sold miracle tonics that promised to heal everything from nerves to heartbreak. Most were just alcohol mixed with sugar and the occasional trace of opium. Effective? Well, maybe not long-term, but certainly relaxing. Despite everything, people adapted. Immigrant communities created vibrant little worlds within the grime. Italians had their bakeries, Jewish families had kosher markets, Irish tenements rang with music and the smell of stew. There were fights, yes, but also loyalty. When someone was sick, neighbors shared food. When someone died, people took up a collection to help bury them properly. Respectability mattered deeply, even when life didn't seem to respect you back. The poor couldn't afford luxuries, but they made their own entertainment. Music, storytelling, reading if you were lucky enough to have a few old books. And gossip, endless gossip. Who ran off with whose husband, who owed rent, who got a new hat from the pawn shop. It was a soap opera before radios existed, and the whole neighborhood was tuned in. The smell of coal was everywhere. Coal-powered factories, trains, and home heating. The air in industrial cities like London and Pittsburgh hung thick with soot, leaving black stains on everything, walls, curtains, even your lungs. Children grew up pale and coughing, their hair grayish with dust before they even turned 10. Yet, when a reformer asked if they wanted to move back to the countryside, most said no. Because grimy as it was, the city meant opportunity, or at least the possibility of it. You could climb in theory. You could save a little money, send your kids to school, maybe open a small shop. It happened rarely, but it did happen, and that faint hope was enough to keep millions clinging to city life. At night, the tenement transformed. By the flicker of oil lamps, families huddled together, patching clothes or mending tools. The sounds of carriages faded, replaced by the creak of wooden floors and the distant hum of factories still running overtime. In the darkness, everything slowed. People told stories, prayed quietly, dreamed of better things. The city never slept, but its people did, fitfully, under thin blankets, with the smell of smoke in the air and tomorrow's work waiting just outside the door. And while reformers wrung their hands about sanitation and morals, the poor simply carried on, resilient, inventive, endlessly tired. They built a kind of beauty out of nothing, a shared rhythm of survival that history books rarely linger on. Because history, as usual, prefers palaces to tenements. But behind every king's portrait, every shining age of progress, there were millions of lives packed into rooms no bigger than a modern kitchen, living, laughing, suffering, enduring. That was tenement life in 1900, a world that was filthy, unfair, and heartbreakingly human. Chapter 3: Factory Life, the grind that built the century. Factories were the beating, smoky heart of 1900. They ran day and night, clattering with machines that never seemed to stop, and filled with people who barely could. If tenement life was about surviving at home, factory life was about surviving at work. You could hear the factories before you saw them, a constant metallic hum that filled the air like an endless mechanical sigh. The smell was unmistakable: oil, sweat, coal, and hot metal. To some, that was the scent of progress. To the people who worked there, it was just Tuesday. Most factory workers didn't have a choice about where they worked. If you lived in a city, the factory owned you as much as it owned its machines. You went where the work was textile mills, match factories, steelworks, mines, or whatever would pay enough to keep your family from starving. Work began early, very early. The morning whistle would blow around 5 or 6, echoing through the streets, and people would pour out of their tiny rooms half-dressed and still chewing the last of yesterday's bread. Breakfast, if you had it, was quick, tea and something starchy to last until lunch, which might not happen. Inside the factory, it was loud. Not, "I can't hear you" loud. My eardrums might give up entirely loud. Machines clanged, gears spun, belts snapped, and all of it blurred into a single, grinding roar. Workers learned to lip-read because speaking over the noise was pointless. By the end of the day, your head would throb from the sound alone. Textile mills were especially brutal. The air was full of fine cotton dust that coated your lungs like powder. Women and children made up most of the workforce there. Nimble fingers were good for threading and weaving, and small bodies could squeeze under machines to fix jams. The machines didn't stop, though, so you learned to work fast and hope your sleeve didn't catch. If it did, there wasn't much left to hope for. Factory owners called the workers hands, which was fitting, since that's all they really wanted, hands that could move quickly and didn't cost too much to replace. There were no earplugs, no gloves, no safety rails. If you lost a finger, you wrapped it in a rag and went back to work. If you lost your life, the foreman hired someone else by lunchtime. Children's work was technically being reformed by 1900, but that depended on where you lived and how poor your family was. In Britain, laws said you had to be at least 12 to work in factories, but only on paper. In practice, 10-year-olds still ran spinning machines, and 8-year-olds swept factory floors. In the United States, child labor laws were patchy at best. Southern mills ran on the energy of small, barefoot workers whose average height was measured more in inches than years. The pay for children was pitiful, a few cents a day, but families needed every coin. Some factory owners even called it moral training, saying work kept kids out of trouble. Sure, because nothing builds character like a 14-hour shift next to a boiling dye vat. Factory life also meant monotony. You didn't make entire products, just parts of them. A worker might spend their whole life hammering the same piece of metal, cutting the same length of cloth, or labeling the same jars. There was no artistry, no pride, just repetition. One man who worked in a shoe factory described it like this: "I have made the same sole for 20 years. Sometimes I think I could make it in my sleep. Perhaps I do." That was the soul of industrialization, mechanical humans serving mechanical gods. The factories themselves were dangerous. Fires broke out often, especially in textile mills where cotton dust hung in the air like kindling. The famous Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 killed 146 people, mostly young immigrant women, but smaller, forgotten fires happened constantly before that. Locked doors, crowded stairwells, no exits. You didn't need to be in a tragedy to feel trapped. Accidents were so common that insurance companies barely blinked. A lost arm might get you a token payment if your employer was feeling generous. But more often, you were simply let go because a one-armed worker wasn't productive enough. There were no pensions, no disability benefits, no fallback plans. You just hoped your neighbors could help, or you starved quietly. Lunch was short, half an hour, maybe less. Workers ate on the floor, in corners, or outside in the soot-black air. Bread, maybe cheese, and tea if you had a thermos. Talking was discouraged, especially in places that paid by the piece. Every minute you spent resting was money lost. Factories ran on time the way ships run on wind, relentlessly, mercilessly. After lunch, it was back to the machines until evening. 12 hours was normal. 14 wasn't unusual. And if you were lucky enough to have Sunday off, you spent most of it recovering, washing clothes, or trying to find the energy to exist as a human again. The rhythm of work left no space for thinking. That was sort of the point. Tired people don't revolt. Health conditions were predictably awful. The constant noise caused hearing loss. The air caused coughing fits. And the long hours caused everything else. In match factories, workers developed something called phossy jaw. The phosphorus used to make matches literally ate away at their bones. Their faces would swell, their teeth would fall out, and their skin would glow faintly in the dark. It sounds like science fiction, but it was just another work hazard. In lead factories, workers' skin turned pale blue from poisoning. In textile mills, the constant motion of looms led to mill fever, a chronic fatigue that left people dizzy and trembling. There was even a term, factory girl's pallor, for the ghostly complexion caused by lack of sunlight. At least the fashion of the time liked pale skin. Silver linings. Despite it all, there were a few perks, if you could call them that. Factories created steady wages. You knew what you'd earn even if it wasn't much. And for many families, that predictability was everything. There were also factory towns, built by employers who provided housing near the mills. On paper, it sounded charitable. In reality, it meant you paid rent directly back to your boss, shopped at the company store, and owed money faster than you could earn it. You load 16 tons and what do you get? As the old song said, another day older and deeper in debt. And yes, that song came later, but the sentiment was alive and well in 1900. Some factories tried to present themselves as enlightened. They offered reading rooms, or temperance lectures, as if a bit of moral guidance could fix poverty. Others allowed sports clubs or social nights to keep morale up. But these were rare, and often more about image than care. A happy worker was productive, and a productive worker was profitable. That was the real philosophy of the age. Women formed a large part of the industrial workforce, especially in textiles, food processing, and garment manufacturing. Their wages were about half of what men earned for the same labor. Factory owners justified it by saying women didn't have families to support, which was both untrue and deeply ironic, since many of them supported entire households. Still, women found independence in work. For some, it was the first taste of life outside the home, and it planted seeds that would later grow into the labor and suffrage movements. But for now, it mostly meant exhaustion. Strikes began to appear. The first major labor movements were forming, quietly but steadily. Workers were realizing that safety, wages, and dignity might actually be negotiable, if you had enough people demanding them. In 1888, the London matchgirls famously walked out of Bryant and May's factory, protesting the deadly phosphorus fumes that caused phossy jaw. They were young, some barely in their teens, and they won. Their small victory echoed across the labor world. By 1900, trade unions were spreading across Europe and America. Employers didn't love that. They called it anarchy, laziness, or ungratefulness. Workers called it wanting to not die at work. Both sides had a point, depending on your definition of progress. But despite reformers, strikes, and small legal changes, the grind went on. Factories defined life for millions. They gave birth to the modern economy and to the modern exhaustion that came with it. You worked to live, but barely. Then you slept and did it all again. If you were a factory worker in 1900, your dreams probably smelled like smoke. You might dream of open air, or a quiet field, or just a day without noise. But dreams were luxuries too. So you woke up before dawn, laced your worn boots, and followed the whistle once more. And outside, the city kept growing. More factories, more smoke, more people. Each one chasing a promise that always seemed just out of reach. Progress demanded sacrifices. And in 1900, the poor paid most of them, in hours, in health, in lives quietly erased from history. The newspapers wrote about inventions and imperial glory. But the real story was happening in the mills and foundries, where tired hands built the century brick by brick, stitch by stitch, bolt by bolt. Factory life wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. It was simply necessary, the human engine that kept the age of progress running. And as the lights went out each night over the city, thousands of workers collapsed into their narrow beds, too tired to dream, too poor to rest, and too needed to stop. Chapter 4. Children of the Slums, Growing Up Poor in 1900. If childhood today means toys, birthdays, and too much sugar, childhood in 1900 meant work, hunger, and whatever scraps of imagination could survive between shifts. Being a poor child wasn't a phase you grew out of. It was a full-time apprenticeship in endurance. In the slums, children were everywhere. They filled alleys, stairwells, rooftops, and the spaces between carts. Cities sounded like them, shouting, laughing, crying, running. They were the background noise of industrial progress, small gears in the great machine of survival. A baby's first cradle might be a drawer, a wooden box, or a basket lined with rags. Blankets were patched together from old coats. Milk, when there was any, might be watered down and served from a bottle with a rag for a teat. Infant mortality was high enough that people whispered new baby names cautiously, as though saying them too loudly might tempt fate to notice. Mothers worked whenever they could, laundry, sewing, cleaning, so older siblings became babysitters before they could spell the word. A 7-year-old might rock a cradle with one hand and stir porridge with the other. Childhood began and ended early. When the sun rose, children spilled into the streets. Some sold newspapers, some polished boots, some begged. Others scavenged, coal dropped from wagons, bits of scrap metal, fruit peels that hadn't yet turned. A lucky find could mean dinner. Newsboys or newsies were the loudest. They shouted headlines they couldn't read, racing each other to the best street corners. A nickel's profit meant the difference between eating and not. In winter, their fingers turned blue on the freezing papers, but they stayed out until the last edition sold. There were flower girls too, like Something Out of My Fair Lady, except the flowers were wilted, and the accents weren't charming so much as desperate. School was theoretically available. Compulsory education laws existed in name, but enforcement was flexible. Many parents couldn't afford the lost wages of a child in class. A boy might attend for a few months in winter when work slowed, then disappear once spring planting or factory hiring began again. The schools themselves varied. Some were overcrowded rooms with cracked walls, 50 students per teacher, and more discipline than instruction. Slate boards instead of paper, rote memorization instead of curiosity. Still, for some children, school was paradise. A warm room, regular hours, maybe even a midday meal. A few bright ones escaped poverty through scholarships or sheer stubbornness, but most simply aged out, returning to the same grind their parents knew. Play existed, but it was improvised. Sticks became swords, hoops became racing circles, bricks became goals. A dead street lamp post was perfect for climbing. A bit of string and a tin lid could become a toy that lasted all week, unless someone stepped on it. City children were streetwise before they could spell their names. They learned which policemen looked the other way, which market stalls might hand over bruised fruit, and how to duck when the landlord's agent came around. Games were loud and often violent, a mix of tag, wrestling, and territorial disputes that left everyone bruised but laughing. It was exercise, entertainment, and community all rolled into one noisy brawl. Meals were family events, though not always happy ones. Bread and tea were staples. Potatoes if you were lucky. Meat on Sundays if someone had done well that week. Mothers stretched food like magicians. A single carrot diced into invisibility, a soup that got thinner each day but never officially ended. Malnutrition was common, but so was ingenuity. A child might chew raw turnips for sweetness or save crusts from the bakery trash heap. Candy was an extravagance, brightly colored lumps of questionable chemistry sold by the piece. Half sugar, half lead, all joy. Diseases moved faster than rumors. Measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, names every family knew too well. Tuberculosis claimed thousands of young lives every year. Doctors were expensive, hospitals overcrowded, and medicine often useless. So mothers relied on home cures, mustard plasters, onion syrup, cod liver oil. Children hated them all, but they kept swallowing because the alternative was worse. When illness came, neighbors helped. They brought broth, watched siblings, whispered prayers. Funerals were small but heartfelt. A child's coffin was sometimes carried by other children, walking solemnly through narrow streets that had heard too much crying already. Work crept into every stage of life. Factory children cleaned machinery. Mine boys, called trappers, sat alone in the dark, opening and closing ventilation doors for hours. In glassworks, tiny apprentices carried molten bulbs too small for adult hands. One slip and that was that. Farm children had their own version of toil, milking cows at dawn, picking stones from fields, carrying water, mending fences. There was no weekend, only weather. Adults said it built discipline. The children mostly built calluses. Despite it all, there were small joys. A penny show in a fairground tent. A church picnic with lemonade that actually had lemons. Ice skates made from scrap metal blades tied to boots. And books, borrowed, traded, read by candlelight until the wax ran out. Stories of adventure, heroes, faraway places. A quiet rebellion against the narrowness of their own lives. One British social worker wrote, "Give a slum child a story, and you've given him a moment's rest from reality." That was the power of imagination in 1900, cheap, silent, and unregulated. Discipline at home could be harsh. Poverty shortens tempers. Fathers came home exhausted, mothers frayed from worry, and children were often on the receiving end of both frustration and love, tangled together. Physical punishment was ordinary, expected, and rarely questioned. Spare the rod and spoil the child wasn't advice, it was policy. Yet affection existed quietly, a saved sweet, a hand on a shoulder, a lullaby hummed off-key while patching clothes. Religion loomed large. Sunday school offered warmth, stories, and sometimes biscuits. Mission workers used hymns to lure children indoors, away from streets they considered sinful. Churches ran soup kitchens, orphanages, and clubs. Some genuinely cared, others wanted souls more than stomachs. Either way, it was attention, and children, being children, took what they could get. Orphans were everywhere. Some lost parents to disease, others to accidents or war, and some were simply abandoned because there wasn't enough to go around. Charity homes took them in grim buildings run by stern matrons who believed hunger built character. Rules were strict, heads bowed at prayers, beds made tight enough to bounce a coin, talking forbidden after lights out. The food was dreadful, but it was food. And compared to the street, even that could feel like mercy. Others joined the vast tide of street children drifting between cities and workhouses. Some slept in doorways, some in train stations. They formed little gangs for protection, part family, part survival unit. Newspapers liked to call them urchins, a word that made misery sound quaint. Every now and then, reformers showed up with notebooks and outrage. They photographed barefoot boys, interviewed pale factory girls, and wrote reports filled with words like depravity and degeneration. They meant well mostly. Their work led to laws against child labor, better housing codes, compulsory schooling. But change was slow, and many of the children in those famous photographs never lived to see it. One reformer described visiting a tenement classroom where 40 children shared a single reader. The youngest had never touched paper before and tried to eat it. Progress, it seems, had a learning curve. And yet, the children laughed. Constantly. Even in the filthiest streets, you could hear them giggling, teasing, inventing songs about local scandals. They built forts out of rubbish, raced rats for fun, and dared each other to knock on rich people's doors. Their humor was rough but alive, a refusal to be crushed completely. Adults noticed. Journalists wrote, almost in wonder, about the irrepressible gaiety of the gutter. Because somehow, even the gutter had music. As the century rolled forward, more voices began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why should children labor when machines could? Why should innocence be taxed by hunger? And slowly, painfully, the answers turned into reforms. Shorter hours, safer workplaces, mandatory schooling. By the 1910s, things were changing. Not fast, not evenly, but changing. The children of 1900 were growing up, carrying with them both the scars and the stubbornness of their beginnings. Some became union organizers, teachers, nurses. Others simply became tired adults who swore their own children would never live that way again. Looking back, it's easy to see only the misery. But there was something else woven through it, a fierce kind of vitality. Those children built the future from the ground up, literally and figuratively. They kept cities alive, carried messages, spun cloth, mined coal, and somehow still found time to laugh in the ruins. Their world was small, gray, and often cruel. But within it beat the same restless human spark that refuses to go out, no matter how cold the wind. So if you picture a slum in 1900, the cracked brick walls, the smoke curling between rooftops, the barefoot children darting through puddles. Don't just see tragedy. See endurance. See imagination holding the line against despair. They were born with nothing, expected little, and gave everything. And somehow, amid the soot and sorrow, they still managed to play. Chapter 5. Domestic Servants, Life Below Stairs in 1900. If you were poor in 1900 but lucky enough not to be starving, you might have been a servant. In service, they called it, which sounded noble, like you'd chosen a calling instead of run out of options. The truth was simpler. Someone had to polish the silver, scrub the floors, and make sure the upper classes never noticed how much life cost to keep running. Domestic service was the single largest employer of women in Britain, and nearly as common elsewhere. In big cities, the servant population was its own hidden nation. They lived under other people's roofs, followed other people's rules, and existed mostly as background noise to someone else's comfort. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fair. But for millions, it was stability, room, board, and a wage that, theoretically, kept you off the streets. The household hierarchy. Below stairs, everything ran on rank. At the top of the servant world was the butler, gatekeeper of the wine cellar, master of ceremony, and walking embodiment of polite disapproval. His word carried weight. Beneath him, the housekeeper, stern, organized, and always slightly terrifying. Together, they ruled the rest like monarchs of their own miniature kingdom. Then came the footmen, chosen less for skill and more for symmetry. If two looked alike enough, they became first and second footmen, identical bookends carrying trays and egos in equal measure. Cooks ran their own empires in the kitchen. A good cook could make or break a household's reputation, and they knew it. They might be gruff, fiery-tempered, and impossible to replace, which made them both indispensable and, frankly, a bit smug. Below them scurried the kitchen maids, scullery maids, laundry maids, parlor maids, and chambermaids, each with a specific set of duties and absolutely no time to question the point of them. And finally, the general servant, one girl doing the work of 5 in smaller homes, a one-woman workforce powered by weak tea and mild resentment. The working day. A servant's day began before dawn and ended whenever the people upstairs decided to sleep. For most, that meant 16 hours on their feet. They woke in the dark to light fires, fetch water, blacken grates, and make sure the world was warm before anyone else stirred. The goal was invisibility. If the master saw you, it usually meant you'd done something wrong. Breakfast wasn't eaten, it was served. And only after everyone upstairs was fed could the staff sneak a bite, usually standing with one ear trained for the bell that might summon them again. Servants' bells were everywhere, little brass monsters wired through walls. Each room upstairs had one, and when it rang, the corresponding bell downstairs jangled on a wooden board, demanding immediate attention. A sort of mechanical reminder that your time wasn't really yours. Wages and promises. The pay? Barely livable. A housemaid might earn 10 to 15 pounds a year, not per month, per year, plus room and board. A butler could make 40 or 50, enough to afford a modest pride. Cooks sat somewhere in between. Most servants sent money home to their families. Savings were difficult. Tips from guests or discarded clothing from the mistress were prized bonuses. A worn-out dress could be altered, a hat refeathered, a pair of boots repaired endlessly. Every so often, an employer would insist they were like family. This was true only in the sense that family can also underpay you and expect gratitude for it. Rules of respectability. The line between servant and employer wasn't just social, it was architectural. Grand houses were designed to hide the staff completely. Separate entrances, separate staircases, separate halls. The rich lived upstairs, the workers underground. Bells connected them, but conversation rarely did. Even speech had class rules. Servants said, "Sir," and "Ma'am," constantly, and never spoke unless spoken to. Their job was to predict needs before they were voiced, tea poured just as a guest sighed, coals added just before the room cooled. And of course, there were uniforms, the visual reminder that you belonged to someone else's household. Starched aprons, polished shoes, hair tucked neatly away. It wasn't vanity, it was obedience woven into fabric. Meals below stairs. When the day's work allowed, servants gathered in the basement dining room, or, more often, the kitchen itself. Meals were practical affairs. Stews thickened with whatever was left, bread baked hard enough to double as defense, and endless cups of tea. Occasionally, they got the leftovers from upstairs, which was both a treat and a test of luck. Cold meats, broken pies, slightly wilted greens. Still, for all its simplicity, mealtime below stairs could be lively. Gossip flowed freely. So did sarcasm. Someone always imitated the mistress's latest tantrum or the master's mysterious business trips. Laughter was the one luxury not taxed. The kitchen world. If you've ever worked in a restaurant, imagine that energy, but with less pay and more Victorian anxiety. The kitchen was the beating heart of the house, hot and loud and always slightly chaotic. The cook barked orders like a general. The scullery maid worked in a cloud of steam, endlessly washing, scrubbing, polishing. Her hands cracked from lye and heat, but she kept going because everyone did. On big estates, dinner for 20 might take all day to prepare. Each dish carefully timed, plated, and sent up through a dumbwaiter or carried by footmen who weren't allowed to sweat in view of the guests. One maid once wrote that her most terrifying duty was carrying soup up the stairs, terrifying because it wobbled, and so did I. Love and loneliness. Servants' lives were so regimented that even feelings had to clock in and out. Romantic relationships were discouraged, improper, they said, especially between different ranks. Still, they happened constantly. There were midnight meetings by the coal shed, whispered notes slipped under doors, and occasional scandals when someone got caught. Pregnancies out of wedlock usually meant dismissal. Some girls vanished home, others to confinement homes run by charities that specialized in quiet shaming. Loneliness was the constant background hum. Servants lived surrounded by people yet isolated from both worlds, too poor for leisure, too intimate with wealth to ignore its distance. They belonged nowhere. Days off and small freedoms. A full day off each week was rare before 1910. Most servants got a few hours on Sunday after church. They used it to walk, read, visit family if nearby, or just sleep without fear of a bell ringing. Those who stayed in the city might stroll in public parks, one of the few free pleasures available. Others met friends in service elsewhere, swapping stories and sometimes clothing. A clean blouse and a small hat could turn even the most exhausted maid into a person again, if only for an afternoon. Respectability and reputation. The strangest thing about service life was how much respectability mattered. Even among the poor, there were hierarchies of morality. A maid who got into trouble was ruined socially, but one who kept her head down and worked hard was considered virtuous. Many young women entered service hoping to improve their marriage prospects. Respectability was currency, and spotless conduct could be traded later for security. So they endured. The endless labor, the small humiliations, the ache in the feet that never quite went away. Because service, for all its miseries, still offered a ladder, narrow, steep, but better than the gutter. The butlers and housekeepers. For the upper servants, life came with its own strange dignity. The butler knew secrets, who drank too much, who couldn't pay their bills, who was pretending to be richer than they were. He kept them all locked away, metaphorically and often literally, in the cellar. Housekeepers were the managers of everything domestic: inventory, wages, linen, moral order. Some were feared, others respected, and all were indispensable. They were the quiet backbone of the household, keeping chaos in check while the upstairs family argued over inheritance or wallpaper. But even they answered to the bell. The children upstairs. Perhaps the most ironic part of service life was that servants often raised the children of people who barely knew them. Nannies and nursery maids spent years with their charges, teaching them manners, dressing them, comforting them at night, only to be dismissed once the children grew up and no longer needed them. Some of those children, now adults, would later walk past their old nurses on the street without recognition. Others sent letters and gifts for decades. It depended on the heart, not the title. Still, the emotional labor of loving children who weren't yours, and being paid to disappear once they no longer did, left quiet scars. Change creeping in. By the early 20th century, domestic service was starting to shrink. Factories, offices, and shops offered new kinds of work, shorter hours, a bit more freedom, and the radical idea of personal time. Electric lighting and new household technologies also reduced demand. Why pay a maid to light lamps when you could flip a switch? Why hire 3 kitchen hands when a gas stove could do the same work faster? Servants began leaving in droves. The rich complained about the servant problem, as if people refusing to be overworked was a puzzling modern illness. But really, it was just history shifting underfoot. The quiet dignity. It's easy now to see servants as footnotes in someone else's story, anonymous figures polishing banisters in period dramas. But in their time, they were the pulse of the household world. They carried the invisible weight of civilization, clean sheets, hot meals, smooth operations, while being almost entirely unseen. Their labor was quiet, endless, and profoundly human. Some took pride in their precision, others simply endured it. But all of them, from the butler to the scullery maid, left fingerprints on history's silverware, even if their names didn't make it onto the family portraits. So next time you watch a show with velvet-clad nobility descending grand staircases, remember the invisible staircases beneath. The ones worn smooth by tired shoes, echoing softly before dawn. Because for every glittering ballroom above, there was a world below, steaming, sighing, laughing quietly at the absurdity of it all. And down there, in the kitchen light, the servants kept the empire running, one scrubbed floor at a time. Chapter 6. Factory Lives, the Industrial Workers of 1900. By 1900, the hum of machines had become the soundtrack of civilization. It wasn't a gentle hum, of course, more like the endless cough of progress. Iron clanking, belts whirring, furnaces roaring. The world had built itself into a mechanical heartbeat, and it thumped from dawn until exhaustion. If you were born poor and not inclined toward farm work or domestic service, the factory was waiting for you. It was always waiting, with open doors, low pay, and just enough stability to trap you forever. The Great Machine. Factories were everywhere by the turn of the century, brick fortresses belching black smoke, sitting like stubborn gods at the edges of towns. Inside, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of workers kept them alive. Men, women, children, everyone had a role in feeding the machine. You could smell a factory town before you saw it. Coal, oil, sweat, and something burnt that no one quite identified. Windows rattled with the constant vibration. You learned to shout over the noise by the age of 12. The machine didn't care who you were, only that you kept up. A day measured by whistles. The day began early, often at 5 in the morning, with the factory whistle. You didn't need an alarm clock. The whole neighborhood woke at once, groaning, stretching, already tired. Most shifts ran 12 hours, sometimes longer. 6 days a week, occasionally 7. A few employers boasted of shorter days, only 10 hours. A humane miracle. Breaks were short, maybe 20 minutes to eat a cold meal out of a tin. Talking was discouraged. So was standing still. Some factories actually installed clocks facing the workers, a reminder that time itself belonged to the owner. The whistle blew again at night, signaling the end of the shift. People stumbled home in the dark, coughing up soot, their clothes stiff with grime. Then they slept, briefly, and did it all again. Men, women, and children. Factories didn't discriminate much. Exploitation was remarkably equal opportunity. Men worked the heaviest jobs: foundries, rail works, machine assembly. Women were common in textile mills, match factories, and packing plants, places where nimble fingers and low pay were apparently natural female advantages. Children filled the gaps. Too small to complain effectively, too cheap to ignore. They swept under machines, carried spools, or worked in coal mines where no adult could fit. Laws against child labor existed on paper, but paper, conveniently, wasn't legally binding for those who couldn't read it. A survey in 1901 found that in parts of England, 1 in 5 factory workers was under 14. In the US, it was worse. Still, some owners defended it proudly. It builds character, they said, which is one way to describe lifelong lung damage. The wages of progress. Pay was low enough to make poverty a full-time commitment. Men might earn 20 shillings a week. Women got half that. Children even less. But you couldn't simply quit. Factories dominated local economies. Leaving meant starvation, not freedom. Rent, bread, coal, and clothes devoured wages almost instantly. Debts piled up. Credit at the corner shop kept families alive between paydays, ensuring the next week began already in deficit. Some factories paid in tokens redeemable only at company-owned stores, where prices were mysteriously higher. A neat little system. You worked for them and you shopped from them too. Accidents and the fine art of not dying. Safety regulations were a kind of optimistic fiction. Belts snapped, boilers exploded, and spinning machines caught hair or sleeves with horrifying speed. Losing a finger was so common it was practically a workplace tradition. In textile mills, the air was thick with lint. Workers inhaled it all day until their lungs turned to felt. Miners fared worse, crushed, gassed, or simply lost to the dark. And yet, people kept showing up. Because the rent didn't care about fingers. There were inspectors, of course, noble men with clipboards who toured the factory floor once every few years. Usually after a disaster. Their reports were full of phrases like regrettable negligence and tragic oversight, followed by a quiet return to business as usual. The rhythm of the mill. Textile mills were the loudest places on earth that didn't involve cannons. The machines, great looms and spindles, never stopped. Conversation was impossible. Workers developed a strange lip-reading dialect just to communicate over the roar. The noise became part of the body. It buzzed in your bones, followed you home, even haunted your dreams. Cotton dust filled the air. Some workers tied rags over their faces, but mostly they just breathed it in. After years of that, lungs forgot how to feel clean air. Doctors called it mill fever. Everyone else called it Tuesday. The match girls and the phossy jaw. If the mills were bad, the match factories were worse. Tiny death traps run on phosphorus and patience. The famous match girls of London worked long hours dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus, a substance that caused a disease so grotesque it sounded made up, phossy jaw. The chemical rotted the jawbone from the inside out, glowing faintly in the dark. Imagine being poor, overworked, and slightly luminous for all the wrong reasons. In 1888, the match girls actually went on strike, one of the first successful labor actions led by women. By 1900, safer red phosphorus was replacing the old kind. A small victory, but one literally earned by bone. The overseers. Every factory had its overseers, men paid to enforce speed, silence, and obedience. They weren't quite management, but definitely not friends. They walked the aisles with stopwatches and sticks, metaphorically or otherwise. Workers called them drivers. The name fit. Some were just bored men doing their job. Others took pleasure in authority, inventing punishments for lateness, slowness, or the crime of existing tired. A few owners installed efficiency systems, early time-tracking methods where every second was measured. Frederick Taylor's scientific management was the fashionable cruelty of the day. The idea was to treat people like parts of a clock. The clock, naturally, belonged to someone else. The smell of progress. Factories redefined what cities smelled like. Coal dust on everything. Grease in the air. Acid fumes from metal works. Laundry never quite came clean. Walls turned gray. People carried the scent of labor like perfume they couldn't afford to wash off. Visitors from the countryside often described industrial cities as hellish. Residents simply called it home. And yet, there was pride buried in it. The smoke meant work. Work meant wages. Wages meant survival. Progress smelled terrible, but it paid, just barely. The social life of exhaustion. Leisure was a rare and fragile concept. Sunday was nominally a day of rest, though most used it to wash clothes, patch boots, and sleep. Some went to church, less from piety than from the promise of free seating and warmth. Still, communities formed around the grind. Pub nights, music halls, and public dances offered brief escapes. You could tell which shift people worked by when they turned up, the late-turn crowd arriving bleary-eyed but determined to wring joy from the hours left. For many, laughter was rebellion. Even if it came between coughing fits. Women of the mill. Women's factory work blurred the lines of respectability. It was honest labor but looked down upon by middle-class moralists. Too public, too noisy, too physical. And yet, it gave women rare independence. Their wages, small as they were, belonged to them, unless, of course, their fathers or husbands disagreed. Many formed friendships stronger than family ties. They worked side by side, shared rent, shared food, shared survival strategies. Some even joined unions, though women were often told to stay quiet while the men negotiated. They didn't. The unions. By 1900, the idea of collective action was gaining traction, literally the only traction most workers had. Strikes were risky. You could lose your job, your home, your reputation. But now and then, people got desperate enough to stop the machine entirely. The owners called them ungrateful. Newspapers called them dangerous. Workers called them necessary. Unions slowly grew. Textile, mining, railway, and engineering unions became lifelines. They won shorter hours, slightly safer conditions, and occasionally even a raise. It wasn't revolution. It was erosion. Small victories wearing down centuries of inequality, one protest at a time. The faces of industry. Photography brought new visibility to factory life. Social reformers began documenting the conditions. Soot-covered children, hollow-eyed women, and men with hands like worn leather. These images shocked polite society, though not enough to make them give up cheap goods. Still, they fueled debates and inspired labor laws that, eventually, changed things. For the workers themselves, the photos were strange. They were rarely seen, rarely recorded. Suddenly, their lives were frozen on glass plates, proof they existed, even if only as symbols. The invented comfort of routine. After years in a factory, the noise became normal. The repetition comforting in a way. You knew what each sound meant. The hiss of steam, the grind of gears, the whistle of shift change. It was predictable. Predictable meant safe. Some even missed it when they left. The silence outside felt wrong. It's strange how easily the body adjusts to misery if you call it routine. Children of industry. Factory children grew into factory adults. Their schooling was limited, their options fewer. But they learned discipline, endurance, and the art of daydreaming while appearing focused. A survival skill still practiced in offices today. The lucky ones moved up to foreman or clerk positions. Most simply aged into fatigue, their health worn out by 40. Retirement was a fantasy. You worked until you couldn't. And when you finally couldn't, your children took your place. The cycle hummed on. Progress and the price. All this labor powered the modern world. Electricity, railroads, steel, textiles, ships. The comforts of the upper classes, the clothes of the middle, the infrastructure of empire, all built by people who'd never afford what they made. There's a kind of irony in that. The people who forged modernity couldn't afford a day off to enjoy it. But that's how history moves. Powered by the tired, polished by the poor, narrated by the rich. Quiet pride. Despite everything, workers took pride in their craft. The weaver who knew her patterns by touch. The machinist who could hear when a gear was off by half a beat. The miner who navigated tunnels like memory itself. They built things that lasted, bridges, rails, engines, though their own lives often didn't. And when they laughed at the end of a shift, it wasn't denial. It was defiance. The world they built. Factories defined the century that followed, not just in production, but in culture. They shaped our schedules, our towns, even our sense of time. Clock in, clock out. Measure worth by output. Work as identity. That began here, in the steam and smoke of 1900. A world that promised progress, demanded exhaustion, and called the exchange fair. And in the middle of it, the workers, ordinary people who turned motion into history, one weary shift at a time. Chapter 7. The Factory Floor, where time and breath were measured in wages. Let's drift now into the rhythmic clatter of industrial life. The hum of machines, the hiss of steam, the dull ache of long hours. By 1900, the Industrial Revolution had been going strong for well over a century in much of Europe and North America. And while it had made fortunes for some, it had also created something new and exhausting: the modern working poor. Factories were the great temples of progress, or so the newspapers liked to say. But for most workers, they were more like sanctuaries of suffering, a place where time, energy, and sometimes limbs were offered up as daily sacrifices to the gods of production. A factory shift was long, often 12 to 14 hours. The day began before the sun rose and ended long after it set. The clock was king now. For the poor, life revolved around the factory whistle, that shrill sound that could mean the start of another endless day, or, if you were lucky, the end of one. In textile mills, the air was thick with fibers. They drifted and danced through the air, glinting faintly in dusty sunlight. Workers breathed them in with every sigh, slowly coating their lungs in fluff. It even had a name: mill fever. Sounds charming, right? It wasn't. Coughs turned into wheezing, and wheezing often turned into funerals. Children were part of this world too. Tiny fingers, small enough to reach between moving gears, were a valuable asset, though, tragically, not one that always survived the day intact. Accidents were so common that factory owners budgeted for them. Literally. There were line items in their accounts labeled for losses due to injury. Still, the pay was better than starving. So parents sent their children in. They told themselves it was just for a few years, just until things got better. But better was a word that rarely showed up in the vocabulary of the industrial poor. The sound inside a factory was constant. A low, metallic roar that pressed against the ears until even silence outside felt deafening. Many workers lost their hearing. Others simply adapted, learning to communicate with nods and gestures. A raised eyebrow could mean, pass the shuttle, or watch your sleeve, or maybe, don't collapse just yet. Lunch was usually eaten standing up. Bread and lard, maybe a cold potato if you were lucky. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and smoke. The rhythm of the machines dictated your chewing speed. Stop for too long, and you might fall behind, which meant fines or worse, dismissal. Let's float over to the match factories, a place that looked harmless from the outside. Inside, the workers, mostly young women, handled white phosphorus day after day. It made the matches light easily and made their jawbones rot away. Phossy jaw, they called it, like it was some quaint nickname. Their breath glowed faintly in the dark from the phosphorus seeping into their bones. It was a grotesque kind of poetry, dying from the very substance that made light. And then there were the coal miners. Always underground, always coughing. They were blackened ghosts who descended before dawn and rose after dark, seeing sunlight maybe once or twice a week. In the mines, time was meaningless. The walls dripped, the lamps flickered, and the air was so thick you could almost chew it. Explosions were common to methane gas and coal dust were just waiting for a spark. When a mine went up, it was over in seconds, hundreds of men gone in a flash. The survivors would come up covered in soot and grief, already knowing their next shift would start the next morning. Because morning didn't pay the rent. Women fared no better. For them, industrial life came with a double burden: 12 hours in the factory, and then a second shift at home, cooking, cleaning, raising children. There was no rest, only the illusion of it. Sunday might offer a few hours of peace, but even then, laundry waited, and so did church. And church had its own rules for the poor. They were told to be grateful for their lot, that work was holy, that suffering was virtuous. The wealthy could afford to be moral philosophers. The poor had to be practical. They prayed for daily bread, not divine insight. In some cities, reformers began to notice, or at least, to say they noticed. Journalists crept into the factories, taking notes and sketching grim little pictures of children in rags. These were printed in papers and magazines, to the horror of middle-class readers who clucked their tongues and went back to their tea. But slowly, something shifted. Labor laws began to form, shaky and inconsistent, but they existed. Yet even then, progress was a slow, reluctant guest. In 1900, in much of the world, a worker's life was still cheap. Injuries didn't bring compensation. Illness meant unemployment. Old age meant starvation. And if you complained, there was always someone desperate enough to take your place. The working poor learned to endure. They became experts in quiet strength. They joked when they could, drank when they had to, and slept like stones when exhaustion finally allowed it. Factories changed the landscape of cities, and the landscape of poverty. Rows of chimneys sprouted like iron trees, their smoke blending into the sky. The air grew darker, and so did the lives lived beneath it. But for all the bleakness, there was something strangely human in it. The way people still found ways to love, to sing, to care for one another amid the grime. They made beauty out of scraps. They patched together joy the way they patched their clothes, unevenly, but with care. And even as the machines drowned out their voices, their resilience hummed beneath it all, steady and unbroken. The factory floor was brutal, yes, but it was also the heartbeat of a new world. One built on sweat and steam, and the quiet determination of those who had nothing else to give but everything. And as the gears turned and the whistles screamed, life went on. Because it had to. Chapter 8. Nights of smoke and ale, the poor at rest, sort of. Let's settle into the softer hours now, if you could even call them that. After a day that stretched endlessly across the factory floor, or through the damp chill of the docks, or down in the coal-black guts of the earth, night was supposed to be rest. But for most of the poor in 1900, night was just another part of survival. The streets after dark had their own rhythm. Lamps burned dimly, flickering against soot-stained brick. The smell of coal smoke and spilled beer hung heavy in the air. The city didn't sleep, it just shifted moods. Day was for labor. Night was for release. For many, that meant the pub. Or, more accurately, the only warm building that welcomed them. Taverns were the social centers of working-class life, equal parts escape, confession booth, and battlefield. The beer was cheap, the gossip was free, and the company was whatever you could tolerate after 14 hours of shouting over machinery. Men crowded shoulder to shoulder at the bar, nursing pints of bitter or stout. Conversation flowed in bursts, talk of wages, strikes, bosses, and sometimes football, if the mood was good enough. The barkeep was a quiet priest of this nightly congregation, listening without judgment as pay packets dissolved into foam and forgetfulness. Of course, not everyone came to drink. Some came to sing. There were songs for everything: work, heartbreak, rebellion, loss. The voices weren't trained or polished, but they were honest. Imagine a low hum of tired humanity, croaking through the smoke. Some sang because it felt good to remember, others because it hurt too much to stop. And somewhere in the corner, a fiddler might scrape out a tune that sounded like both laughter and grief rolled into one. Someone would start dancing, awkwardly at first, then others would join, boots thudding on floorboards, laughter spilling through the door into the cold street. It wasn't glamour, but it was life. For the women, leisure was often a cruel joke. After the factory, there was cooking, scrubbing, and sewing. But even they found moments of rest, gossiping in doorways, trading advice about children, or sitting together by dim candlelight, mending clothes and talking about the world beyond the alley. Sometimes, on a rare good night, they'd sneak a drink too. And if they were caught, well, let's just say the men weren't always the only ones who could throw a punch. Still, not all nights were merry. Poverty has a way of turning celebration into necessity. Many drank not for fun, but for relief. Gin was a particular favorite, cheap, strong, and dangerously easy to forget with. It blurred the edges of hunger, softened the ache in the bones, and quieted the thoughts that came too easily in the dark. And then, of course, there were the lodging houses, the grim alternative for those without homes of their own. Picture a long, narrow room filled with rows of narrow beds, or sometimes just benches. The air was thick with breath and damp wool. In some places, they didn't even offer beds, just ropes stretched across the room where people could sleep sitting up, slumped over like marionettes with their strings cut. It was called a 4-penny rope. Sounds made up, but it wasn't. Nighttime also belonged to those who couldn't afford to sleep at all. Street sellers hawked roasted chestnuts or newspapers under the dim glow of gaslights. Women in threadbare shawls loitered on corners, offering comfort for the price of a meal. Policemen trudged by, boots echoing through empty lanes, pretending not to see what they couldn't afford to fix. For children, night could be its own adventure or its own danger. Some scavenged through market refuse for scraps they could sell in the morning. Others slept under bridges, clutching each other for warmth. The idea of bedtime was a privilege, not a routine. But there were brighter corners too. Churches opened soup kitchens. Mutual aid societies formed, small, scrappy groups of workers who pooled pennies to help each other in sickness or unemployment. They were the beginnings of what would one day become unions and social safety nets. At night, in tiny rented halls, these groups met by candlelight to argue, plan, and dream. The dreams were modest: shorter hours, safer workplaces, enough food, maybe a bit of dignity. But in 1900, those were radical ideas. The poor were supposed to accept their fate after all. That was the natural order, or so the rich said, from the comfort of drawing rooms lined with velvet and brandy. Yet the poor did something remarkable. They found meaning where the world offered none. They made rituals out of hardship, humor out of hunger. In the pubs and alleys, they forged communities, messy, loud, and imperfect, but deeply human. Even the streets had their familiar faces. The night watchman with his lantern, the milkman's cart rumbling at dawn, the woman selling violets on the corner who always smiled, even when her fingers were blue from cold. If you stood quietly in a poor district around midnight, you might hear the city breathing, the creak of beds, the crackle of firewood, the distant hum of factory wheels still turning for the night shift. Life never stopped. It just slowed, wrapped itself in shadow, and whispered instead of shouting. And for a few precious hours, even the most exhausted could dream. Maybe of fields without fences, or homes without damp walls. Maybe of waking up and not having to count coins before breakfast. The dreams weren't grand, just simple, human, and endlessly out of reach. By morning, the whistle would blow again, slicing through the thin fabric of rest. Boots would hit the cobblestones, eyes still heavy, hands still aching. Another day, another wage, another slow, smoky evening waiting at the end of it. Because in 1900, the poor didn't live in days or weeks. They lived in shifts, one long, gray stretch of effort, punctuated by ale, laughter, and the occasional flicker of hope. And somehow, that was enough to keep the world turning. Chapter 9. Sickness, Strain, and the Miracle Cures of 1900. If you were poor in 1900, health was a precarious luxury. Life itself was a kind of chronic illness, punctuated by minor injuries, exhaustion, and the occasional epidemic that could sweep through a neighborhood like wind through dry leaves. Doctors existed, of course, but they were usually expensive, and most people only saw them when the alternative was obvious death. In smaller towns, a doctor might live nearby but rely on horse-drawn visits, slow, irregular, and expensive. In cities, they were almost as unreachable. Medicine was a luxury. The only affordable remedy for many was perseverance. The everyday ailments. Workers' bodies bore the brunt of poverty. Fingers lost in factory machinery, backs bent by endless labor, lungs coated in smoke, coal dust, or cotton lint. Feet blistered from long marches to factories, swollen from standing for hours on cobblestones. And yet, a stiff back or a persistent cough was often shrugged off. It had to be. You didn't have time to be ill. Children suffered too. Malnutrition made them small and fragile. Winter colds often turned into pneumonia. Minor injuries became infected. And yet, they kept working, often alongside adults who were barely healthier themselves. Epidemics and contagion. Cities were full of people, and people were full of diseases. Typhoid, tuberculosis, cholera, smallpox. These weren't words from a textbook. They were names that appeared in whispers on street corners and obituaries. Tuberculosis, in particular, was a quiet thief. It crept through the lungs over months or years, wasting the body slowly, leaving the victim pale, coughing, and exhausted. And because it often struck the poor, it was called the disease of the slums, as if poverty itself had germs attached. Vaccination existed for some diseases, but coverage was uneven. Some families trusted doctors, others trusted rumor. Advice was inconsistent, and misinformation flourished. The apothecary and the miracle cure. For those who could scrape together a few pence, the apothecary offered an array of strange comforts. Tinctures, powders, and tonics promised relief, sometimes from real illnesses, sometimes from imagined ones, and sometimes from nothing at all. Patent medicines were particularly popular. The labels promised everything: cures all ailments, restores vitality, guaranteed to make you strong, happy, and rich. None of this was usually true. But desperation is persuasive, and the flavors were often better than water. A sweet syrup could numb the hunger for a while, even if it didn't cure scurvy. Many contained alcohol, opiates, or both. A dose of laudanum could take the edge off pain, cold, hunger, or exhaustion, and sometimes all at once. It was effective in the short term and addictive in the long. But in a world without real relief, it was a kind of mercy. Midwives and home remedies. For women, childbirth was particularly dangerous. Hospitals were few and far between, expensive, and often unhygienic. Midwives were the frontline medical workers, guiding mothers through birth with skill, intuition, and an occasional curse under their breath. At home, remedies were cobbled together from herbs, vinegar, and kitchen ingenuity. Honey for coughs, poultices for wounds, tea to settle upset stomachs. Some worked, many didn't. Some made things worse. But trying something was better than doing nothing, and the resourcefulness was a kind of quiet pride. Hospitals, sanctuaries, or prisons. For the seriously ill, hospitals were a mixed blessing. They could save lives, yes, but they were cold, crowded, and often unsympathetic. Beds were scarce. Nurses were overworked. Hygiene was improving but still imperfect. Infection was a constant companion, sometimes more dangerous than the original illness. Patients often described hospitals as a place where time slowed down. Days stretched endlessly. The world outside continued, but inside, you were mostly waiting. Waiting for care, waiting for medicine, waiting to die or improve. The emotional toll. Illness was more than physical. Poverty made it psychological, too. Worry over missing work, losing wages, or leaving children hungry gnawed at patience even when they could rest. A cold could cascade into missed pay, debt, and despair. Families often had to choose between care and survival. Sick breadwinners were sent back to work too soon. Children went without attention. And still, life continued, stubborn and relentless. Malnutrition and the hidden scars. Food scarcity and poor quality added their own cruel layer. Diets were repetitive: bread, potatoes, tea, and occasionally meat if there was money left. Vitamins were a mystery, scurvy a threat. Children grew weak, adults aged faster. The body adapted, but adaptation was costly. Stamina wore thin, resistance to disease dropped, and small injuries or infections could become fatal. Poverty was a slow, unrelenting disease in itself. The industrial workplace and health. Factories didn't just injure bodies with machines, they slowly poisoned them. Chemical fumes in textile mills, dye factories, and matchworks could damage lungs, eyes, and skin. Lead and arsenic were common, often untreated. People built tolerance over years, but at a cost. Chronic illnesses became background noise, part of the rhythm of life. Pain was normal, suffering was expected, and yet work continued. Families relied on every wage. Communities accepted sickness almost like they accepted weather, a force to endure rather than challenge. Folk wisdom. Amid all this, folk remedies flourished. A stiff back might be treated with mustard plasters. A persistent cough with a mix of onions and sugar. Chicken broth for almost everything. Prayer, charms, and old wives' tales guided many through what medicine could not. The line between superstition and science was blurry. Sometimes the cures worked, sometimes they didn't, but the belief in them offered comfort. That, too, was a form of medicine, gentle, if ineffective. Mental strain. Physical illness was only part of the story. The mental strain of poverty, endless work, and witnessing suffering was enormous. Depression, anxiety, and despair were common, though rarely named. People coped in small ways: gossip, humor, songs, small rituals. They memorized poems, kept small talismans, or simply endured in silence. There was resilience in quiet suffering. a subtle defiance against a world that constantly demanded more than it gave. Public health slowly awakens. By 1900, governments and reformers were slowly noticing the problem. Sanitation campaigns, water purification, and vaccination drives began to reduce epidemics. Factories were inspected, sometimes. Children's labor was limited, in theory, but real change was gradual. For the majority, life remained a fragile balance between survival and catastrophe, and every cough or accident carried the weight of risk. Death in the shadows. Death was intimate, constant, and unceremonious. Funerals were brief. Gravestones often simple. Life expectancy for the urban poor lingered in the 30s or 40s, a stark contrast to the wealthier classes. Yet even here, there were small victories. Communities supported each other through grief. Mutual aid societies covered funeral costs. Families carried on, mourning quietly, often in the same homes where life had been hard but not unbearable. A quiet resilience. And still, there was resilience. People worked, they loved, they laughed, they grieved. They found small joys, a warm hearth, a neighbor's visit, a shared meal. The human spirit, though stretched thin, remained. Illness was not always a death sentence. Care, ingenuity, and a little luck could carry someone through. The poor developed an intimate knowledge of bodies, remedies, and survival strategies, wisdom that wasn't taught in schools but earned in sweat and tears. And in the quiet of a sick room, or a dimly lit kitchen, or a coal-black bedroom, life went on. Slowly, carefully, with a soft insistence that existence, no matter how fragile, still mattered. So in 1900, being poor meant facing illness constantly, from the minor aches of overwork to epidemics that swept entire neighborhoods. Medicine was imperfect, life expectancy low, and comfort rare. But people endured. They endured because they had to, and because in the endurance, they found a quiet dignity, a stubborn, almost imperceptible defiance against a world that constantly reminded them of their limits. The sick, the tired, the hungry, they persisted. And in their persistence, they carried the fragile, fumbling hope of a future just out of reach. Chapter 10. Children of Poverty, Play, Work, and Survival in 1900. If you were born poor in 1900, childhood was a curious blend of work, wonder, and relentless responsibility. You weren't really a child for long. Life demanded too much attention, too early. The world outside your window was full of labor, noise, and cautionary tales, and you learned to navigate it with surprising skill. Play existed, of course, it just wasn't always obvious. A game of marbles in a soot-streaked alley, spinning tops made from scrap wood, or chasing friends across cobblestones before the factory whistle blew. But even these moments carried shadows, the fear of broken bones, angry neighbors, or the approach of adults demanding you earn your keep. Work starts early. For the urban poor, children often started working as soon as they could walk steadily. Factory floors, textile mills, coal mines, bakeries, street stalls, these were their classrooms. Learning to survive meant learning a trade, often dangerous and exhausting. A 12-year-old girl might spend her day tending machines or cleaning chimneys, returning home with hands red and cracked from heat or lie. A boy the same age might deliver milk, sweep streets, or sell newspapers, carrying not only goods but also the weight of family expectation. The logic was simple: everyone had to contribute. Every penny counted. Hunger could not wait for maturity. Street children. Not every child had a home. Orphaned, abandoned, or simply left to fend for themselves, street children were experts in improvisation. They scavenged, begged, and bartered. Every alley held secrets, every market stall a potential profit. Some became message runners, selling letters or parcels between families too poor for postal fees. Others hawked matches, newspapers, or fruit from sunrise until sundown, learning early how to negotiate, persuade, and survive. Their education came from observation. How to read adults' moods, how to avoid trouble, how to slip unseen through crowded streets. School was rare. Lessons in arithmetic might come from counting coins or measuring flour, not from books. Play among hardship. Even amidst hardship, children found ways to play. Improvised toys were everywhere: bottle caps for coins, sticks for swords, scraps of cloth for dolls. A cardboard box could become a fort. The imagination worked overtime, transforming the barren streets into kingdoms and battlefields. But play was often punctuated by work. A rolling hoop might be left unfinished as a parent called, "Help with the firewood," or "Watch your sister." Childhood was elastic, stretching and contracting according to the demands of survival. Still, these games were crucial. They offered a moment of agency, of freedom, and of simple joy in a world that gave very little. The education gap. Formal education was a luxury for many. While the government tried to expand schooling, attendance was sporadic. Children were pulled from class for work, illness, or family emergencies. Some schools doubled as daycare during the day and night refuges for the youngest workers. Teachers were often overwhelmed. Classrooms were overcrowded, supplies scarce. Yet, some children learned literacy, numeracy, and even geography enough to make sense of the world, or at least keep it manageable. Education was uneven, fragile, and always competing with the immediate demands of survival. Labor laws and reform. By 1900, reforms were creeping in, slowly, inconsistently. Child labor laws existed on paper but were poorly enforced. Children under 14 were technically prohibited from working in dangerous industries, yet enforcement varied wildly. Factories employed children openly, sometimes arguing that small hands were necessary for delicate work. Coal mines, textile mills, and match factories often turned a blind eye. Enforcement relied on inspectors, who visited irregularly and often sympathized with employers more than children. And yet, reform movements were growing. Social workers, journalists, and activists documented conditions, raised awareness, and sometimes rescued children from the worst abuses. The seeds of a safer childhood were being sown, slowly, hesitantly, but undeniably. Health and nutrition. Childhood poverty came with constant physical strain. Meals were meager, often repetitive: bread, potatoes, and the occasional piece of meat or cheese. Malnutrition left children small, weak, and vulnerable to disease. Illnesses that today might seem minor could turn deadly. Measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever. They swept through poor neighborhoods with devastating speed. Families tried home remedies: honey, herbs, vinegar, sometimes with mild success. Often, illness was a waiting game: survive or succumb. Despite these hardships, children adapted. Their bodies were resilient, their imaginations sharper for necessity. They learned to survive in ways adults sometimes overlooked, noticing hidden exits, improvising tools, and identifying the small kindnesses that could save a day. Family dynamics. Families were tight-knit, often by necessity rather than choice. Children contributed to household survival from a young age, doing chores, watching siblings, and earning wages. Yet, tension was common. Adults were stretched thin, tempers frayed, and resources scarce. Arguments over food, money, and responsibility were frequent. Children learned diplomacy early: when to speak, when to be silent, when to help, and when to hide. Paradoxically, these pressures also created bonds. Families shared everything: warmth, meals, advice, and love. A shared struggle forged a closeness that wealth sometimes undermined. Apprenticeships and skills. Some children left home to apprentice with craftsmen. They learned trades like shoemaking, carpentry, tailoring, or printing. Apprenticeships were hard, often exploitative, but they offered a path to slightly better futures. The work was long, the pay small, but the knowledge gained was invaluable. By their late teens, a skilled apprentice could sometimes find work that was safer and slightly better paid than factory labor. It wasn't comfort, but it was progress. For girls, domestic service remained the most common option. They learned sewing, cooking, cleaning, skills that could sustain them and sometimes provide a path out of poverty. But it was often grueling and socially constrained. The streets as school. For those without apprenticeships or schooling, the streets were education. Observation, mimicry, and improvisation became survival tools. Children learned languages, social hierarchies, and the subtle rules of negotiation. They learned which adults were trustworthy, which corners were dangerous, and which opportunities could be exploited for small profit. These lessons were practical, often learned at the cost of safety or comfort, yet they were essential. Childhood in 1900 was less about innocence and more about preparation, risk and adventure. Despite the dangers, children took risks, sometimes recklessly. Climbing scaffolding, exploring abandoned buildings, or swimming in polluted rivers, all offered glimpses of freedom. Adventure was their respite. Even the poorest children carved out spaces for joy, curiosity, and play. In alleys and markets, rooftops and hidden courtyards, childhood blossomed quietly against the backdrop of struggle. Humor and resilience. Humor was everywhere. Children made jokes about adult absurdities, the contradictions of authority, and the daily grind. They teased each other, imitated adults, and found delight in small victories. This humor was not frivolous. It was a survival mechanism, a way to endure what could not be endured otherwise. Laughter became a shield, a form of quiet rebellion, a momentary claim to control. Dreams of escape. Even children dreamed, sometimes vividly, sometimes as quiet fantasies. They imagined better futures, sometimes inspired by passing strangers, rare books, or overheard conversations. Dreams were private treasures, nurtured in secret corners or under beds. For some, the dream was simple: enough food, a warm bed, an hour of play. For others, it was bigger: escape from the streets, a trade learned well, a life away from factories and alleys. Dreams kept them moving, kept them surviving, kept them human. Community and solidarity. Children learned quickly that survival depended on others. Older siblings cared for younger ones. Neighbors shared food, advice, and small comforts. Playmates doubled as allies, protecting each other from bullies, authority figures, or sheer misfortune. Communities of children were microcosms of society, social hierarchies, alliances, and negotiations mirroring the adult world. They learned responsibility, loyalty, and the complex art of survival before they were even teenagers. Childhood as labor. In 1900, childhood was largely synonymous with labor. Even play was constrained by responsibility. Yet within this labor, children carved out spaces of autonomy and identity. They learned to observe, to anticipate, and to navigate the complex social and economic world of poverty. The paradox of childhood in 1900 was that it was both fragile and resilient. Fragile because the environment was unforgiving, and resilient because children adapted, endured, and found joy where it could exist. The invisible contribution. Children were not passive observers. They were active participants in the household economy, the labor market, and community survival. They carried water, swept streets, sold goods, ran errands, and often earned their keep. Their work was invisible to the wealthy and lightly noticed by reformers. Yet it was essential. Families depended on it. Communities thrived because of it. And society itself, with all its industrial growth and social change, was built on the backs of these small, determined workers. The lessons of survival. If there is one thing to take away from childhood in 1900, it is that survival was an education in itself. Children learned skills, resourcefulness, humor, empathy, and resilience, lessons that no school could replicate. They grew up fast but not on. Chapter 11. The Margins of Society, the Elderly and Disabled Poor in 1900. By the time someone reached old age in 1900, they were already remarkable simply for surviving. Life for the poor was unforgiving, and few made it beyond their 40s without accumulating injuries, chronic illness, or permanent fatigue. Those who did reach the later years often lived on the very margins of society, invisible in the rush of industrialization and urban growth. Aging without retirement. Retirement was a luxury almost unheard of for the working poor. Pensions were limited to certain government or industrial employees. Most ordinary laborers had no safety net. You worked until your body gave out, and even then, you might continue to scrape a living through odd jobs or begging. The elderly poor were a familiar sight in city streets. They shuffled through alleys, hobbled on canes, or sat outside tenement doorways, silent and observing. Their hands were cracked and knotted from decades of labor, their eyes dimmed by years of exposure to coal smoke, sunlight, and hard work. Despite their condition, they often maintained a quiet authority. The neighborhood children respected them, shopkeepers tolerated their presence, and younger workers occasionally asked for advice, because decades of survival produced wisdom, even if the world never formally acknowledged it. Work that would not end. For those who could still move, some work remained. Elderly men might haul coal or wood, repair streets, or take small tasks in workshops. Elderly women often washed clothes, mended garments, or cared for grandchildren. Work wasn't just about income, it was about purpose, about staying visible, about asserting existence in a society that preferred to forget the old. Even small injuries could be devastating. A fall could mean permanent disability, and without family or charity, such a misstep often meant homelessness or illness. Yet the elderly persisted. They had little choice, and perhaps no other way to maintain dignity. Disability and stigma. Disability was common, either from work accidents, disease, or congenital conditions. Yet society offered almost no support. Hospitals sometimes treated acute injuries but rarely provided rehabilitation. Prosthetics existed but were expensive and rudimentary. Many were left to adapt in whatever ways they could. Being visibly disabled also carried social stigma. Begging was the primary option for survival, which subjected individuals to ridicule and suspicion. The fortunate few were cared for by family, but families themselves were stretched thin. Disability was not just a personal struggle, it was an economic and social burden as well. Housing the marginalized. Tenements, almshouses, and workhouses were often the only options for those too frail to work. Conditions were grim, overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and unsanitary. Disease spread quickly, and privacy was non-existent. Almshouses provided shelter, but at the cost of independence. Rules were strict, food was minimal, and the pace of life was dictated by the institution rather than the individual. Workhouses, in particular, were harsh, with strict routines, hard labor, and little comfort. Many old or disabled residents found these places dehumanizing, a final indignity after decades of toil. Community support. Despite official neglect, informal community support existed. Neighbors often shared food, medicine, or warmth. Local churches provided small amounts of assistance, whether in the form of bread, coal, or occasional clothing. Mutual aid societies occasionally extended membership to elderly or disabled members, though resources were always limited. Social networks were crucial. A friendly shopkeeper, a sympathetic neighbor, a cousin willing to take in an extra mouth. These small acts could make the difference between surviving and succumbing to exposure or starvation. Illness and frailty. Chronic illness defined much of life on the margins. Arthritis, respiratory diseases, and cardiovascular conditions were common, largely untreated. Pain was constant and often ignored, because life demanded attention elsewhere. Tuberculosis, lingering from youth, might flare up again. Heart disease and strokes, poorly understood, often ended life suddenly. Even minor infections could be fatal. Without proper treatment, what might today be a simple antibiotic prescription was then a slow, lingering decline. Death as a neighbor. For the elderly and disabled poor, death was rarely shocking. It was expected, understood, and often quietly observed. Funerals were modest, sometimes unpaid for, sometimes carried out with the help of neighbors or charitable societies. Death was a practical matter, not a spectacle. A chair left empty, a bed unmade, a meal skipped. These were the indicators that someone had gone. Communities adjusted, continued, and quietly remembered. Adaptation and ingenuity. Life at the margins required ingenuity. Makeshift prosthetics, adapted tools, and careful routines allowed some elderly or disabled poor to maintain independence longer than expected. A bent cane, a stool in the kitchen, or a pulley for laundry could mean hours of saved energy and extended survival. This adaptability was a testament to human resilience. The body may have faltered, but the mind found ways to negotiate the limitations. The emotional landscape. beyond physical hardship, the emotional burden was heavy. The elderly watched younger generations struggle, sometimes wishing to intervene but lacking the strength or resources. They lived in a paradox, simultaneously experienced and powerless. Loneliness was pervasive. Adult children often worked long hours, leaving little time for company. Friends died or moved. The streets grew emptier, the alleys quieter. Yet many elderly maintained routines, rituals, and small pleasures. A cup of tea, a conversation over a fence, watching children play. Humor persisted too, dry and quiet. Jokes were often sardonic, reflecting decades of observation. A smile at absurdity was sometimes all that stood between despair and endurance. The invisible workforce. Even in their frailty, the elderly contributed. They cared for grandchildren, managed household tasks, and occasionally performed light labor. They were part of the economy, whether acknowledged or not. Their labor was invisible, unpaid, and essential. Society largely ignored them, but families often depended on their continued presence. The wisdom and guidance they offered was invaluable, though frequently unrecorded. Survival strategies. Resourcefulness defined survival. Every penny was rationed, every scrap of food preserved. Neighborhood networks provided intelligence, which shops offered credit, which streets were safer at night, which medicines worked, and which were scams. Old age did not excuse poverty, it compounded it. And yet, those who endured developed skills and instincts unmatched by the young. They learned patience, observation, and subtle negotiation, the tools that allowed survival in a world indifferent to their existence. A quiet dignity. Despite neglect, the elderly poor often retained a quiet dignity. They refused to be invisible when possible. They imparted knowledge, shared stories, and maintained small traditions that anchored the community. This dignity was uncelebrated by historians or reformers. It existed quietly, in the edges of daily life, in whispered advice to children, in careful preservation of a family meal. Social change slowly creeps in. By the turn of the century, some reforms were beginning to recognize the needs of the elderly and disabled. Pension schemes, charitable organizations, and medical improvements offered glimmers of hope, but change was slow and uneven. Most elderly poor still depended on family, charity, or sheer stubborn endurance. Yet the existence of reformers and advocates hinted that perhaps the next generation would fare slightly better. The margins as a mirror. The lives of the elderly and disabled poor mirrored the broader realities of poverty. Vulnerability, invisibility, and resilience defined daily existence. Society moved forward, often oblivious to those it left behind, yet those left behind persisted, quietly shaping neighborhoods, traditions, and social memory. They reminded communities of continuity, of endurance, and of the quiet power of those who survived despite everything. Endurance as legacy. For many, survival itself was an achievement. Simply existing day after day, tending what needed tending, maintaining connections, observing and instructing younger generations, these were legacies. Though the wealthy rarely acknowledged it, the elderly and disabled poor carried the wisdom, memory, and moral threads of their communities. Their stories were less recorded, but no less vital. In a world focused on labor, progress, and profit, their endurance was remarkable, and their presence, even in silence, demanded acknowledgement. Quiet reflection. In 1900, life at the margins was relentless. The elderly and disabled poor bore the accumulated consequences of decades of labor, hardship, and illness. Yet they survived, adapted, and contributed. They formed the invisible backbone of urban and rural life. Their existence was a quiet testament to resilience, a subtle challenge to a society that often forgot them. In small acts of care, in daily routines, in the preservation of dignity, they shaped the fabric of community life in ways both visible and invisible. And in the end, perhaps that quiet persistence was the most profound form of survival available in a world that demanded so much and gave so little. Chapter 12. Women of Poverty, Labor, Survival, and Unseen Strength in 1900. If you were poor and female in 1900, life was a unique form of endurance. Men had their factories, mines, and streets. Women had work too, but layered with expectation, responsibility, and a social invisibility that made survival simultaneously harder and more nuanced. Work at home. The majority of poor women lived with a dual burden. They might earn a wage outside the home, but domestic labor never ended. Cooking, cleaning, washing, mending, and childcare were constant demands, stretching long past the factory whistle or street shift. Washing clothes was brutal labor. Streets or backyards often doubled as laundry areas. Water had to be fetched, soap improvised, and laundry dried on lines regardless of weather. Soap was harsh, water was cold, and the hands and back bore the cost. Cooking was another story. Stoves were inefficient, often fueled by coal or wood. Meals were small, repetitive, and shared with family members who often worked outside for long hours. Children's demands didn't pause while the mother was exhausted. Work outside the home. Some women supplemented household labor with paid work. Factory work was common. Textile mills, garment shops, match factories. Conditions mirrored the general industrial poor, long hours, low pay, and frequent injury, but women often earned even less than men for equivalent work. Domestic service offered another option. Girls as young as 12 or 13 were sent to wealthy households to cook, clean, and serve. These positions were considered respectable, but were grueling and socially isolating. Abuses were frequent, from verbal reprimand to physical punishment. Privacy and rest were scarce. Street work also existed. Women sold flowers, newspapers, or small wares in alleys and marketplaces. Some walked long distances to deliver goods. Some engaged in informal care work, like looking after neighbors' children. Every penny counted, and every day demanded ingenuity. The physical toll. Physical strain defined daily life. Women carried water, firewood, or coal. Their backs, shoulders, and hands bore constant pressure. Repeated strain led to chronic pain, joint problems, and early aging. Pregnancy added another layer of challenge. Many women had children close together, with little rest or medical support. Childbirth was dangerous. Maternal mortality remained high, particularly among the urban poor. Midwives were the frontline caregivers, guiding women through these perils with skill, intuition, and scarce supplies. Health and hygiene. Hygiene was challenging, particularly in overcrowded tenements. Baths were rare, water often cold and limited. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and smallpox were constant threats. Women bore not only their own illness but also the care of sick family members, multiplying physical and emotional strain. Nutrition was also a constant concern. Women often sacrificed their own meals to feed children or husbands. Diets were repetitive: potatoes, bread, occasional vegetables, and rarely meat. Malnutrition was common, and its effects were visible in energy levels, appearance, and vulnerability to disease. Emotional labor. Alongside physical work came emotional labor. Women mediated disputes, soothed fears, and maintained household morale. They managed resources, budgets, and survival strategies. They were planners, negotiators, and often the quiet backbone of extended families. Yet society rarely acknowledged this work. The labor of women was expected, undervalued, and socially invisible. They were caretakers, by default, often without recognition, support, or respite. Social expectations. Society imposed additional layers of expectation. Poor women were judged not only for their labor but for their morality. Walking the streets alone could invite suspicion. Poverty itself was often equated with moral weakness. Marriage was idealized, but for many women, economic survival dictated choices. Some married early for financial security, others delayed marriage to continue earning. Widowhood or single motherhood added peril, with little societal or institutional support. Community networks. Women built networks of support. Neighbors, friends, and extended family shared food, advice, childcare, and small luxuries. Mutual aid and informal economies were essential. These networks were often gendered, women teaching women, sharing tips on childcare, household management, and survival. The small acts of solidarity were critical. Lending a pot, sharing coal, or caring for a sick child could mean the difference between crisis and continuity. These invisible threads held communities together. Work in childhood. Women also bore responsibility for children's survival and education. They ensured the youngest contributed to household labor while balancing schooling when possible. They taught skills, managed chores, and guided children through work and play. Even here, their labor was invisible. Society saw the child, but rarely the woman behind the child's survival and education. Yet her efforts shaped the household economy and future of the family. Resilience and ingenuity. Ingenuity was a hallmark of survival. Women learned to stretch meager resources, repair clothing, and repurpose scraps. Every penny, piece of fabric, and leftover meal was a potential lifeline. They adapted kitchens into workshops, bedrooms into workspaces, and alleys into marketplaces. Creativity was survival. Ingenuity was ordinary. Leisure and small joys. Even amidst relentless labor, women found moments of personal joy. A few minutes with a book, a conversation with a neighbor, a candlelit meal, or a whispered joke were treasures. Humor was subtle, dry, and often sarcastic. It was a defense mechanism, a small rebellion, and a source of resilience. It reminded women of their humanity, even when the world treated them as functionaries of survival. The intersection of poverty and gender. Being poor and female compounded hardship. Physical strain, social expectations, and limited economic opportunities created a unique landscape of challenge. Yet it also created spaces for agency, wisdom, and leadership within households and communities. Women managed resources, shaped children's futures, and mediated social networks. They were, in many ways, the invisible managers of survival, the quiet architects of resilience in a world that rarely paused to acknowledge them. Public assistance and reform. By 1900, social reforms were beginning to acknowledge women's struggles, though unevenly. Workhouse regulations, charity organizations, and early social services offered some relief. Yet many women remained unsupported. Bureaucracy, inconsistent enforcement, and social bias meant aid often fell short. Survival required not just labor but knowledge of who could help, when and how, another layer of complexity in an already demanding life. Illness and maternal strain. Maternal health was precarious. Midwives and home remedies were primary care, and medical access was limited. Maternal mortality remained high. Even minor infections or complications could become fatal. Women also managed illness in the family, carrying not only their own vulnerability but that of children, spouses, and older relatives. Emotional resilience was required alongside physical stamina. Aging and continued labor. For many poor women, labor didn't end with age. They continued domestic work, childcare, and sometimes paid labor into old age. Their bodies carried scars of decades of work, bent spines, cracked hands, and exhausted lungs. Yet their contributions were vital. They maintained households, ensured children survived, and mediated community ties. Aging did not diminish their importance, though society often overlooked it. Humor, resistance, and strength. Humor was essential. Sarcasm, irony, and small jokes became survival tools. They helped women cope with social expectation, physical exhaustion, and the inequities of life. Resistance was quiet but present, bending rules to protect children, negotiating with employers, or preserving dignity in harsh conditions. Strength was measured not in wealth but in endurance, creativity, and subtle acts of defiance. Legacy of survival. Poor women of 1900 left lasting legacies. Children raised, communities stabilized, households managed, and social bonds preserved. Their labor, largely invisible, was foundational to family, neighborhood, and society. Even unrecorded, their stories echo in survival strategies, shared wisdom, and the resilience of communities. They demonstrate that endurance, intelligence, and care can persist even in the harshest circumstances. Quiet reflection. Life for women of poverty in 1900 was unrelenting, physically demanding, emotionally complex, and socially constrained. Yet it was also characterized by ingenuity, quiet humor, and persistent resilience. They worked inside and outside the home, navigated social stigma, managed households, and shaped the next generation. Their labor was both survival and care, their endurance both necessity and quiet triumph. In every small action, every improvised meal, every whispered joke, they carved out humanity and dignity. Theirs was a life of invisible heroism, endurance without applause, and strength without recognition. And despite relentless hardship, they survived, shaping families, communities, and history in ways largely unrecorded, but profoundly felt. Chapter 13: Tenements and Streets, Life in the Urban Poor Quarters of 1900. By 1900, cities were swelling with people. Industrialization, migration, and economic necessity had packed men, women, and children into neighborhoods where space was scarce, and comfort even scarcer. If you were poor, the streets and tenements were your world. A world both bustling and oppressive, intimate and indifferent. Arrival and crowding. Entering a poor neighborhood was like stepping into a living organism. The streets were narrow, buildings pressed tightly together, and windows rarely opened for fresh air. Every doorway, alley, and stoop was in use. Children played, merchants hawked goods, neighbors chatted, and laundry fluttered from every available line. Tenements were crammed to capacity. Families often lived in 1 or 2 rooms, sharing them with relatives or strangers. Privacy was non-existent. Walls were thin, voices, arguments, and coughs traveled freely. Every sound, every scent, every movement was communal. The architecture of hardship. Tenements were utilitarian at best. They were tall, narrow, and dark, often lacking proper ventilation or sanitation. Fire escapes offered only limited safety. Stairwells were steep and dimly lit. Windows faced other windows, so light and air were minimal. Shared bathrooms were common, and plumbing was rudimentary. Water had to be fetched and carried. Waste disposal was inconsistent, leading to odor, disease, and discomfort. Hygiene was a daily negotiation between scarcity, labor, and ingenuity. Daily rhythms. The streets themselves were alive. Morning brought the clatter of carts, the shouts of vendors, and the whistle of factory supervisors. Children ran errands, delivered goods, or played briefly before duties resumed. Adults moved quickly, carrying provisions, tending jobs, and negotiating the intricacies of neighborhood life. Evening brought a quieter bustle. Lamps flickered to life. Smells of cooking, coal, and refuse mingled. Voices softened, but the neighborhood never fully slept. The tenement itself was noisy. Coughs, footsteps, and occasional arguments persisted through the night. Tenement families. Family life in a tenement was intimate, intense, and constant. Generations often lived together, squeezed into minimal space. Children slept in narrow beds or shared floor space. Parents occupied the smallest corners they could claim. Meals were communal affairs, simple and repetitive: bread, potatoes, small portions of meat when available. Conversations were practical, often focused on work, bills, and survival. Laughter existed but was sparse, quiet, and precious. Sanitation and health. Sanitation was a perpetual struggle. Garbage piled in alleys. Sewage sometimes backed up into homes. Rats and vermin were omnipresent. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. Tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, and influenza were common threats. Residents adapted. They learned which streets were cleaner, which neighbors were careful, and which routines reduced risk. Knowledge was practical and essential. Ignorance could be fatal. Economic pressures. Rent consumed a large portion of income. Eviction was a constant fear. Tenants might share apartments with strangers to reduce cost, creating even greater crowding. Landlords often neglected maintenance. Repairs were rare unless enforced by law or necessity. Utilities were minimal. Coal or wood for heating had to be purchased, often in small, expensive quantities. Lighting came from gas or candle. Water was fetched from pumps or shared taps. Every basic need was negotiated with effort, time, and limited funds. Work and the commute. The proximity of tenements to factories, workshops, and markets defined daily life. Commutes were short but exhausting. People walked miles in worn shoes, sometimes carrying tools, goods, or children. Physical exertion began before breakfast and continued into the evening. Street life functioned as a kind of extended workspace. Informal markets, street vendors, and small workshops operated from alleys and doorsteps. Children contributed, hawking newspapers, matches, or small goods to supplement family income. Community bonds. Despite crowding and hardship, community bonds were strong. Neighbors shared food, clothing, and knowledge. Doors were rarely locked. Privacy was a luxury. Mutual aid was informal but essential. Advice on illness, child rearing, or employment circulated quickly. Celebrations were modest but important. Birthdays, religious holidays, and occasional local fairs provided rare moments of respite. These events reinforced bonds, offered emotional relief, and allowed small joys to permeate an otherwise demanding existence. Crime and policing. Poverty increased vulnerability to crime, both petty and serious. Pickpockets, thieves, and con artists operated openly. Children learned to navigate risk, which streets were safe, which adults could be trusted, and when to flee. Police presence existed but was inconsistent. Officers often patrolled with little interest in minor disputes unless property or authority was directly challenged. Neighborhoods maintained informal systems of order. Respect, reputation, and vigilance were the currency of safety. Noise and sensory life. The urban poor lived in a constantly noisy environment. Factory whistles, carts, shouting, children, and domestic activity created a soundscape that never fully quieted. Smells of cooking, sewage, coal, and livestock mixed in a dense olfactory tapestry. Despite these challenges, residents developed tolerance and adaptation. Routine sounds and smells became background rhythm. Only anomalies demanded attention. Adaptation was survival. Light and darkness. Electric lighting was limited. Gas lamps flickered in streets. Darkness was part of life, shaping schedules, caution, and social interaction. Women returning from late work shifted quietly through shadows. Children navigating streets at dusk learned to move with care. Night also brought relief from labor, brief socialization, and occasional entertainment. Taverns, small theaters, and street performances offered transient escape. Even modest lighting was enough to create small communities of shared experience. Access to food shaped every decision. Markets offered fresh produce, bread, and occasionally meat, but at prices that required careful calculation. Meals were simple, repetitive, and limited. Bread, potatoes, and soup formed the staples, with occasional variations when funds permitted. Cooking itself was a labor. Kitchens were small, shared, or improvised. Fuel was expensive. Meals had to stretch across families, often leaving adults or children hungry. Creativity and resourcefulness were essential in creating edible, sustaining food. Child life in tenements. Children were simultaneously workers, learners, and playmakers. Space for play was minimal. Alleys, rooftops, and shared courtyards became playgrounds. Education was sporadic, often interrupted by work or illness. Childhood in the tenement was compressed. Play existed, but responsibility dominated. Children learned survival skills early: observation, negotiation, and careful movement. These skills became foundational for adult life. Adaptation and survival. Tenement life required constant negotiation. Every day involved trade-offs: comfort for income, space for family, hygiene for food. Residents became experts in improvisation, adapting environments to human needs despite architectural and economic limitations. The streets themselves were classrooms, workshops, and marketplaces. Residents learned quickly how to navigate risk, form alliances, and secure essentials. These skills were essential and passed down across generations. Humor and resilience. Despite conditions, humor persisted. Sarcasm, witty commentary, and dry observation were common coping mechanisms. Jokes softened harsh realities, created community bonds, and allowed residents to maintain a sense of humanity. Resilience was quiet. Endurance, resourcefulness, and adaptability defined tenement life. Pride and dignity were preserved in small acts, caring for children, sharing food, and maintaining household routines. Reflection. Tenements were more than buildings. They were ecosystems of survival. They housed families, children, the elderly, and the disabled, each navigating physical, economic, and social challenges. The streets, alleys, and courtyards formed networks of interaction, support, and informal economy. Life was relentless, yet it was structured. Residents found routines, humor, and small joys. Communities adapted, survived, and sometimes thrived despite scarcity, disease, and overpopulation. Tenement life was a masterclass in resilience, the ability to exist, adapt, and maintain humanity under conditions designed for endurance rather than comfort. The invisible architecture. The true architecture of tenements was human, not structural. Families, neighbors, and children created routines, networks, and survival strategies within physical constraints. Every staircase, alley, and shared kitchen became a site of negotiation, teaching, and adaptation. This invisible architecture held communities together. It was built from trust, observation, improvisation, and mutual reliance, a social scaffolding that allowed life to continue in the face of material scarcity. Quiet legacy. Tenement life shaped generations. Children learned skills and survival strategies that would inform their adult labor. Women maintained households and nurtured children under extreme conditions. Elderly residents offered guidance, wisdom, and continuity. The neighborhood itself became a living history, a record of struggle, adaptation, and human persistence. Its legacy was quiet but profound, shaping the urban poor in ways that would ripple across decades. Endurance as culture. By the end of the day, tenements were silent only briefly. Residents adapted to noise, dirt, crowding, and scarcity. Life in the tenements was endurance, physical, emotional, and social. It was also culture. Humor, routines, social networks, and rituals created a rhythm to life, however harsh. Endurance became identity, hardship became shared experience, and survival became a quiet triumph. Reflection in darkness. In the flicker of gas lamps or the dim morning light filtering through tenement windows, human presence persisted. Children played, adults labored, women managed households, and the elderly observed. Communities were fragile but resilient. In these streets and tenements, the urban poor of 1900 lived fully, if precariously. They survived, adapted, and maintained humanity in conditions designed to strip it away. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of tenement life, that resilience, ingenuity, and shared experience could persist even where comfort, space, and opportunity were almost non-existent. Chapter 14. After Dark, Nighttime Life and Survival in Urban Poverty, 1900. Once the sun dipped below the rooftops of tenements and factories, the urban poor entered a different rhythm of life. Daylight brought work, noise, and structured chaos. Night brought shadows, opportunity, and a mix of fear and freedom. Evening transition. As gas lamps flickered on and factories quieted, streets changed character. Children who had played briefly during daylight hours returned to narrow apartments or crowded tenements. Adults emerged from workshops and markets, some returning home, others lingering in alleys or taverns. Night required caution. Darkness concealed not only opportunity but risk. Streets that seemed familiar in daylight could become treacherous under dim light. Residents learned to move carefully, keeping to known paths, avoiding suspicious areas, and relying on memory and instinct to navigate safely. Night labor existed alongside daytime work. Some women worked late shifts in laundries, bakeries, or factories. Street vendors continued to sell goods, newspapers, and matches. Men carried out deliveries, repaired streets, or performed informal labor in alleys and workshops. Night work was both survival and necessity. Pay was often slightly higher for late hours, but the risks increased. Fatigue, accidents, and encounters with crime were more likely. Those who persisted balanced income with the constant awareness of vulnerability. Street vendors and economy. The streets themselves became marketplaces of a different sort. Vendors sold candles, food, or small household goods to residents finishing their work or returning home. Informal economies thrived in dimly lit alleys, everything from mending services to small-scale black market trade. Children often assisted in these night economies, carrying goods, delivering packages, or selling small items. Their small size and agility made them useful, though also exposed them to hazards, including accidents, adult authority, and street crime. Crime and vigilance. Nighttime heightened risks. Pickpockets, thieves, and occasional violent crime preyed on those who were distracted, tired, or vulnerable. Fear was a constant companion, shaping routes, behavior, and interactions. Neighborhood vigilance was essential. Residents relied on informal networks, trusted friends or relatives who patrolled streets, alerted others to danger, or provided refuge. Reputation mattered. An established presence in the community often offered protection. Outsiders were more exposed. Lighting and visibility. Gas lamps and flickering candles provided limited illumination. Shadows dominated streets, hallways, and tenement interiors. Residents learned to move strategically, using walls, doorways, and lamp pools to their advantage. Lighting dictated social behavior. Some activities were restricted to well-lit areas, others only occurred in shadowed spaces. Awareness of light and darkness was a practical survival skill, teaching observation, discretion, and timing. Domestic nightlife. Inside tenements, evening routines continued. Meals were simple, often prepared quickly and shared in cramped spaces. Water had to be fetched, and fires maintained for warmth or cooking. Children bathed, if at all, and chores continued under the dim glow of lamps. Family interactions at night were intimate yet constrained. Conversations, advice, or instruction occurred quietly. Noise carried easily, and sleep was a precious commodity. Every movement was negotiated to avoid disturbing neighbors or family members. Social interaction. Despite scarcity and constraint, night offered opportunities for socialization. Taverns, coffee houses, and informal meeting spaces provided respite. Gossip, humor, and stories circulated, strengthening community ties and offering mental relief. Women, in particular, found brief moments of conversation, shared humor, or planning for the next day. These small interactions were essential. Emotional labor continued at night, just in quieter, more strategic ways. Nighttime danger for children. Children faced unique risks. Darkness limited visibility, making travel hazardous. They learned to navigate streets with care, memorizing lamp posts, familiar alleys, and safe shortcuts. Yet night offered excitement and autonomy. Some children traded small goods, ran errands, or explored spaces forbidden during the day. Risk and adventure coexisted, teaching judgment, observation, and improvisation. Crime as opportunity. Some residents engaged in opportunistic crime, petty theft, informal hustling, or scavenging. Necessity often dictated participation. Theft wasn't always malicious, it was survival-driven. Law enforcement at night was inconsistent. Police patrolled irregularly, and justice was slow or biased. Communities often self-regulated. Informal authority, reputation, and local knowledge kept minor disputes in check. Vulnerability and adaptation. Night increased vulnerability for all, elderly, women, children, and disabled residents. Adaptation was essential. Curfews, accompaniment by family or neighbors, and strategic movement through safe zones were common. Observation skills sharpened at night. Recognizing patterns, reading behavior, and predicting danger became second nature. Adaptation was not optional. It was a necessity for survival. Nighttime labor of women. Women continued their labor at night when necessary: laundry, sewing, cleaning, or preparing food for the next day. Nighttime tasks were often quieter but still physically demanding. For those working outside the home, commuting in darkness posed additional hazards. Fatigue compounded risks. Yet women persisted, balancing survival, household needs, and limited personal safety. Food and night economy. Food preparation extended into the night. Bread might be baked, stews simmered, and meals rationed for early morning. Street food vendors served laborers, night travelers, or children returning from errands. The night economy reflected scarcity. Improvisation, bartering, and negotiation were constant. Everything had value, and every opportunity was assessed for risk and reward. Housing constraints. Tenements offered little reprieve from darkness. Shared rooms, thin walls, and overcrowding meant that sleep was intermittent. Noise, coughing, or arguments disturbed rest. Residents created routines to maximize comfort and safety. Stools, blankets, and minimal furniture were arranged for efficiency. Strategic placement of lamps, water, and food reduced nighttime labor and disruption. Hygiene and health. Nighttime hygiene was minimal but necessary. Limited water, poor plumbing, and shared facilities complicated bathing and sanitation. Illness often worsened overnight due to fatigue, exposure, or inadequate care. Residents improvised, washing in basins, using shared water sparingly, and caring for sick family members quietly. Adaptation continued through the night, as survival didn't pause when darkness fell. Humor and storytelling. Evenings were opportunities for storytelling and humor. Families, neighbors, and children exchanged anecdotes, jokes, and reflections on daily hardship. Humor was often dry, sardonic, and quietly defiant. These moments reinforced social bonds, provided emotional relief, and maintained dignity. Humor was survival as much as food or shelter. Community surveillance. Communities relied on collective awareness. Groups might patrol streets, share information about potential dangers, or protect children. Reputation and local knowledge created informal networks of safety. Trust was selective. Outsiders were treated with caution. Family and neighbors were primary allies. Survival was social as much as physical. Night as reflection. Night offered a different perspective on urban poverty. Darkness magnified vulnerability but also highlighted resilience. Residents adapted routines, leveraged community networks, and maintained essential labor. Even amid scarcity, danger, and fatigue, humans found ways to persist. Every task, every journey, every shared moment was an exercise in endurance. The invisible workforce. Nighttime labor was often invisible. Women worked quietly, children carried goods, men delivered or repaired. These activities sustained households, neighborhoods, and the broader urban economy. Yet the contributions of the nighttime poor went largely unrecognized. Their labor maintained continuity, prevented crises, and ensured survival. Endurance and observation. Night sharpened observation skills. Residents learned to navigate shadows, anticipate danger, and maximize limited resources. Endurance became both physical and mental. The urban poor developed intuition, timing, and improvisation that allowed them to survive conditions others might find intolerable. Resilience in darkness. Despite fatigue, danger, and scarcity, the nighttime poor demonstrated resilience. Routine, humor, social bonds, and improvisation created structure in the chaos. Life persisted not because of comfort, but because humans adapted to constraint, learned from observation, and leveraged community. The rhythm of urban nightlife. Nighttime in 1900 urban poverty was a continuous rhythm. Preparation, labor, vigilance, socialization, and rest. Residents moved through darkness with purpose, balancing necessity and safety. The rhythm reflected endurance, small victories, improvisation, and mutual reliance. Survival was incremental, quiet, and relentless. Reflection. As gas lamps flickered and the city settled into the quiet hum of nocturnal life, the urban poor continued their work, both visible and invisible. Families maintained routines, communities monitored streets, and individuals adapted to every challenge. Nighttime life was a microcosm of poverty itself: scarcity, danger, resilience, and quiet dignity. It required awareness, courage, and creativity, all exercised under dim light and constant constraint. Even in darkness, life continued, persistent and uncelebrated. Endurance was both necessity and art, and the nighttime urban poor of 1900 embodied it fully.